as I left Logan and I was driving home, I was out of the dark night of the soul from that week. And I got home and I recognized that I couldn't heal if I was continually rewounded. And so in talking about it with my wife and my dear friend, my bishop, I told him that I have to take a sabbatical. I can't do this. It's too painful. And my dear bishop told me, I'm going to support you in whatever you decide to do. If you're happy at church, come to church. And if you're not, don't come. But it doesn't make any difference how we feel about you. And I told him, I said, I can't be a home teacher. I can't be asked to give a priesthood blessing, because I had unpacked the messiness of the priesthood restoration by that point. I had been consuming so much information about church history. And he asked, do you want me to tell Will? Will was my high priest group leader. I said, no, Will's my friend. I said, I need to tell Will in person. Because when I was high priest group leader, a member of our high priest group went through faith crisis and left. And I thought maybe it was my fault. And I needed Will to know that it wasn't his fault. And so I contacted Will and I took yours and others' advice. I didn't get into the weeds. I just said, I've stumbled across difficult church history and the gospel topics essays, and I've encountered things that I haven't been able to reconcile. And my views about the church have changed, and I need to take a break. And I can't be a home teacher anymore. And Will said, I want you to meet with me. And he says, I know it's going to look like I'm trying to convince you not to take a sabbatical, but I just want to meet with you because I want to understand. And so I went and met with my friend Will for a couple hours and found out that he was way more nuanced than I thought he was. And he said, I want to understand what happened. And I'm like, are you sure? Because, what if you react like I did to this information? And he said, no, I want to understand. He said, because I have multiple members of our family that due to intellectual issues lost their belief and have left the church, and they're too angry to talk about it. And I want to understand why. And so I did. I started unpacking some of the weeds, and he was able to hold that somehow. He was that nuanced. And he was compassionate. And these men trusted me in my experience, even though I was coming to such disparate reconciliations. To give you an idea of how nuanced my wife is, at that time, we found ourselves on a walk, not too far from the temple, because it's so close to our house, and there's a field and a walking path there. And we're walking along, and I asked my wife, how in the world can you be supporting me in my journey when I'm coming to all these reconciliations, or conclusions is the word I used at the time. Conclusions sounds like a much more final word, right? So I prefer reconciliations now because things are subject to change. But how can you support me when I'm coming to all these conclusions that are so different than you about the church? How can you possibly do that? And she said, well, it's like our son. She said, I don't believe our son chose to be gay. And I don't believe God would want him to live a life absent the kind of intimacy that we share. But I trust my son, and I want him to have those experiences. And I trust God, and I trust that it'll all work out in the end. And that's how I feel about you. I know you're not making this up. I don't think you're deceived by Satan. I know this is a sincere thing that you're experiencing, and I don't know how it works, but I trust you, and I trust God, and I trust that it'll all work out in the end. And again, I would say, how do you do that? Because I couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand that degree of nuance. As I unpacked things and we would periodically discuss things, I realized that we were in a mixed faith marriage and I had no idea. And I'd say, but D&C 138 and general conference talks, like if the brethren give a talk and it's something that offends your inner conscious, your inner voice, like, doesn't that mean that they're watchmen at the tower and D&C 138 applies and they have divine appointment and discernment? And if it doesn't sit well with us, it's because we're not being humble and we either need to shelve it or we need to pray to God to understand, you know? And she's like, no, if it doesn't work for me, it doesn't work for me. I'm like, what? What is that? You know, she didn't grow up as a McConkie, Hinckley, Packer, Benson Mormon. She wasn't. And all this time, you know, 26 years of marriage, and I had no idea how nuanced she was. We were in a mixed faith marriage and I didn't know it. So I came back and I started my sabbatical and I worked really hard on processing grief, the grieving process. I used entrepreneurial tools. There were people that I talked to. I had phone conversations. I traveled down to meet with the Mormon historians group and met Robin Jensen, and we went to the Church History Museum, and I was freaking out because they like had the seer stone there and the Kirtland Bank stuff and the different versions of the First Vision right there in the Church History Museum. I'm like, that would have crashed my shelf, just going to the Church History Museum, you know. And I got all this help, and I started to heal, and things shifted inside of me. I followed yours and others' advice about not making rash decisions while I was in grief. I told myself that I wouldn't make any decisions about my membership or resigning for at least a year. I told myself that I wouldn't be public about it until I was no longer in grief, or at least a year. You know, I did have a public conversation once, and one of my dear, dear friends publicly shamed me as a core whore. And it was so painful. And I knew I couldn't do that, and I knew he couldn't hold it. He accused me of some great sin, because the only way that I could have spiritual experiences about inaccurate things is deception by Satan under his construct. And, you know, my dear friend loves me and I love him, but he couldn't hold that. So in any event, I continue to heal. And then on December 1st, in the Salt Lake Tribune, there was an article that said in the next year, in 2017, the essays would be supplemental material for gospel doctrine. And I felt like I can talk about the essays with my friends now because they're going to learn about them next year, right? And Elder Ballard told the CS that they were supposed to teach the essays to the seminary students. You know, I told my bishop, you need to study the essays because the seminary kids are going to learn about this, and then they're going to go home and they're going to ask their parents about polyandry. And my wife agreed to study the essays because I told her that our kids needed to hear about the essays from us and not come to us later and ask if we knew about it and then sense betrayal because we hadn't told them about it first. And so she slowly, it took her about a year. I think she did an essay a month. I'm not quite sure how she handled it. But in any event, so what I did is I created a friends list of about 100 local members that I felt like could hold the conversation, and also members from my nuanced Mormon groups or post-Mormon groups. And I created this friends list, and I did a post linking that Salt Lake Tribune article saying this is going to be interesting with the essays next year. I stumbled across things with the essays that I couldn't reconcile. And so I'm getting feedback from my local friends, you know, that have different degrees of nuance or orthodoxy. And one of my friends who I used to debate about vaccines and so forth and politics and so forth, you know, we were friends on a surface level. I included him in the group, and he commented, "What essays?" And I'm like, "Well, here's the link." And he and read the essays. And then the subsequent, maybe about 3 hours, he totally crashed in front of like a couple hundred people in that thread, my dear friend. And I'm trying to hold him. Like, he's like, what? And he like reads the First Vision essay and the race essay, and he's reading these things, and he's totally crashing right in front of everyone. And I'm trying to hold him. I'm like, well, there's Faithful Reconciliations, and there's the Givens book, and there's the Ash book, and there's the Laura Hales book, and so forth, all in front of that. And then I continue, message him, and then a few weeks later, he's asking friends about it, and he stumbles across the CS letter, and then I'm trying to hold him from that, this man who's become a very dear friend of mine. Through all this, I'm trying to catch him. And I have people messaging me privately saying, thank you so much for talking about these things. I have been in so much pain because I've been unpacking these things, and I thought I was going insane and that I was all alone, or I can't talk about this with my spouse because I'm afraid I'm going to lose my marriage. And I start processing these things, and then I start to heal more. I have some polemic interactions with some apologists online, because whether they want to believe it or not, the experience is that when we're unpacking these things and when we're processing grief and anger and depression, like, we speak with emotionally charged language. We just do. And so then we go to a Daniel Peterson page or something like that, and we're asking sincere questions, but it's emotionally charged because we're grieving. And then we get met with gaslighting and smackdowns and ridicule, and I knew this when I was 9, and you were just lazy, and you must have not been very curious about your faith, and you were weak, and all of this kind of stuff, right? Totally unhelpful. And I got in some pretty polemic conversations with a few of them. But something weird happened because I ended up with these very, very close friendships with a few of them. And there's one who's a former, it's complicated, but he's a former professor at Dixie in St. George. And there's one who's a dear friend now, who's an African-American amateur apologist, philosopher type of person. And I developed these friendships with these people, and they helped me increase my capacity to express myself in less emotionally charged language. And they trusted, even though we have totally different reconciliations about things, they trusted my experience. And that was incredibly healing, to develop these relationships with them. And I created a Mormonspectrum group, but I was afraid to do anything with it because I still wanted to be a member, and I didn't want to get at risk of church discipline. And I met with my dear friends in the stake presidency. They called me in. They spent a few hours.
Did you feel like creating a support group might get you in trouble?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, because the Church Handbook of Instructions, it was born out of what happened in the past, where you'd get these study groups and they'd start reading the Journal of Discourses and then practice polygamy or something like that.
Right.
And then I remember the letter that was read that said you shouldn't go to Sunstone. It actually didn't say Sunstone. You shouldn't go to symposia, right?
Right.
And so the Church Handbook of Instructions, says that. And in Billings, Montana, the leadership is pretty black and white. Like, they go by the manual. There's some beautiful analogies. My dear friend and business partner in the real estate development complex, my stake president, I told him about it. He hadn't read the essays yet. I told him what happened, and he gave this beautiful allegory. This was earlier in the process. He said, imagine you spent your whole life building this amazingly beautiful 1,000-piece puzzle that gives you meaning of life and purpose and, he didn't use the word constructs, but how you view things. And then through no fault of your own, your 1,000-piece puzzle that was the foundation of everything gets knocked onto the floor, and it's all lying on the floor in 1,000 pieces. And that's what's happened to you. And what you're going to do now is you're going to lean down onto the floor and you're going to pick up one piece at a time, and you're going to look at it and you're going to sit with it, and you're going to determine whether that's something that could be in your new puzzle. And if it is, you'll set it on the table. And if it's not, you'll set it aside. And over time, you'll pick up pieces and you'll put them on your table and you're going to build a new puzzle. But it's going to be a lot smaller than the old one. But it's actually going to be stronger and more meaningful because it's going to be a puzzle that you created. And at the time he shared that metaphor or allegory with me, like I didn't even have the strength to pick up one piece because it was during the dark night when he shared that with me. But over time, that's been a very, very meaningful story. And anyway, he and the other members of the stake presidency invited me in. They wanted to let me know what the line of apostasy was. They wanted to know my concerns. They didn't have a way to reconcile that I had spiritual experiences about inaccurate things. By that point, they had read the essays. By that point, because of what happened to me, my bishop told our ward council they had to study the essays. And I was experiencing extreme dissonance because so many of my friends were studying the essays and not coming to the same reconciliation as me. The stake high council, I don't know if it's just me or if it was other people, but the stake high council were studying the essays together and unpacking them in high council meeting on Sunday mornings. And I was experiencing extreme dissonance as to how they could read cited source number 9 and not have a similar experience to me in the race essay, or read the actual First Vision accounts and not deal with the experience that I had. But of course, I was bringing different experience to the table with that because I saw the evolution of theology of Joseph Smith in the scriptures and in the history, and that matched up exactly to the different accounts of the First Vision, thinking he's just retelling a story based on his evolved theology. Like if he gave a version of the First Vision after the King Follett Discourse, it would have been a different version, right? Because it's just he was imputing his evolution of theology. How can my friends on the High Council not see that? And I told the stake presidency, I'm like, I'm not going to send anyone the CS letter or to Mormon Think. But if people ask, I'm going to send them to the Essays or Rough Stone Rolling or Fair Mormon, right? And they're like, okay, well, the line of apostasy would be sending them to those other critical things. And I'm like, look, if you think that my interactions with people constitute apostasy, just let me know and I'll resign. Because I'm not going to put you, my friends, and my friends on the High Council, almost every single one of which were friends of mine with whom I served, I'm not going to put you through a disciplinary council. So you just let me know. No. We're not thinking that. We just wanted to let you know what the line was. And these are my dear friends. Like one on the High Council or on the stake presidency, we went to lunch together and talked about this and unpacked this. They were genuinely concerned about me and what I was experiencing. So in any event, where are we on time?
We were at 2.5, and I just ordered lunch, and so I'm stalling until lunch comes.
Okay. All right. So when lunch comes, then we'll take a break. All right. So anyway, so my apologist friend.
And this is wonderful.
Thank you.
And a lot of the feedback I got from listeners with Donna was just let your guests talk. And so I'm doing that.
Oh, very good.
Well, I'm thinking when you need to meditate and do your yoga thing, you let me know.
Yeah, okay. So we'll have some teaching moments in here. But this whole background and context will give you a context of the Reconstruction phase. So during all of this, I was reaching out to some people. And, some of my friends, including members of our Mormonspectrum group, when they went through a faith transition, it was so painful because everyone disappeared on them. They didn't know. Like one of my dear friends just stopped attending and no one reached out to her at all. Nothing. Zero. And I had about a half dozen friends on top of those that were assigned to me, so my home teacher and my bishop and my stake presidency, they were assigned to me. But I had about a half dozen other friends reach out to me to find out if I was okay and what I was doing. And one set of friends is a dear friend that was my prior home teacher that was in another ward because of a boundary change. And I was visiting with him and his wife. He had read Rough Stone Rolling. He had to kind of reorder his view of Joseph Smith after reading Rough Stone Rolling. And he was teaching seminary. So I thought for sure he was teaching the essays. He's like, no, we weren't told to teach the essays. And I'm like, really? Because the CES presentation from Elder Ballard said you're supposed to know it by like the back of your hand. And anyway, almost exactly a year to the day from the crash, the wife of this dear couple thought she was sending me a private message. And she wasn't. She posted to my Facebook timeline.
Oops.
And she wrote, I just want you to know that the Lunds love you, and it doesn't matter to us if you're not Mormon anymore. On my Facebook. And I had already come out to, my kids and to my mother. I wrote a letter to my mother and to my sister-in-law and come out to my mother-in-law and so forth. So I had already come out with regard to my changed beliefs. Again, staying out of the weeds, my views about the church have changed. I can't reconcile these things. My interpretation of the word of wisdom is different. So you might find me with a coffee instead of a Diet Coke, or I might drink a glass of wine with dinner or something like that. But I'm the same person. My marriage is strong. I'm not going to go off the deep end. I seek divinity in my life, addressing what their primary concerns would be. That letter that I wrote to my mother was helpful enough that I actually put it in one of my blog posts on my blog, unpackingambiguity.com. And people have found that helpful, that letter to my mother, because there was a lot of thought that I put into that as to how I came out to her about my changed belief. Anyway, my dear friend, Sister Lund, outs me on Facebook. And about an hour or two after the post, I get a message from a dear friend in support groups who lives outside of Boise. And she messaged me and she says, I can't believe she did that to you. And I'm like, who, what? And I go online and I look at my Facebook post and she put this on my wall for all her friends and all my friends to see. And there were already people answering with compassion. And my friend modeled compassion. And by that time, I was largely done retraversing the stages of grief with regard to my lost faith and belief and community and reputation and identity, that I let it stand. One of my dear friends said, I don't know what's going on, but I'm on Team Anthony, and it was great. And so I was outed. And a little bit more than a month and a half later, I did my full public post as to my changed beliefs. I titled it The Why, and explained, some of you have noticed that I've been posting about these kinds of things, and this is the why. And I was totally out with my faith. So my change of beliefs. These online support groups like the A Thoughtful Faith group were critically important to my journey, and they acted kind of like my journal of what happened. Is I would deconstruct something new, I would do a Facebook post in A Thoughtful Faith or Thoughtful Transitions, sometimes in the Mormon Stories podcast community, about something that I had unpacked or deconstructed. And that ended up being my journal. And so what I did is I went back to my original A Thoughtful Faith introductory post, and I made a comment below to tell people how I was doing a year later, and then providing links kind of as a directory or index to the other posts that I made. And then I took those posts as well, and I copied them into an electronic document so that I could keep them. And that was extremely helpful to my journey. It's also been extremely helpful because I'm no longer a member of the A Thoughtful Faith group. And had I left or been asked to leave or deleted from the group before I had the opportunity to go back and gather those posts and that information, two things would have happened. Number one, that would have been extremely painful because I would have had very vulnerable conversations left in a thoughtful faith without my ability to go back and delete or modify them. And then the second reason, probably the bigger reason that would have been painful, would have been that information. That was my story. That was my journal. And I needed to be able to copy that stuff and transfer it to electronic documents that I could later post on my blog or keep for myself. It was very, very important. I know people have had very disparate experiences with the thoughtful faith. I know that you recently have as well. And I experienced privilege there, because I contributed a lot. Sometimes I went beyond the rules in terms of my conversation that might have got other people kicked out, and I would edit them. I probably was a pain in Mark's side multiple times. I know I was, and I've asked for forgiveness, and he told me, "Don't worry about it." But in the end, in November of 2018, in talking with Jerry and Mark, I recognized that I needed to leave. And it was because my presence there made it not the same safe place it was when I entered there. Because what I needed in June of 2016, the November 2018 me would have made that not the same safe place. So I understand that. And so they gracefully allowed me to do a farewell post, not an exit post, but a farewell post. And it was extremely meaningful to me. I know other people, not too long after that, there was kind of I know that the moderators don't like to call it the purge, but that's what people experienced. Something like more than 800 members were summarily and without warning deleted from the group. And it was extremely traumatic for many of those people. Some of them have told me it was more painful than their leaving the church, was with what happened with a thoughtful faith, because they had vulnerable things left there in the open, because they had all this, the right word isn't intellectual capital, but basically their journal and their story is there, and they can't access it, and they don't have that information. It was like their journal was taken from them, and it was extremely painful. I have a tremendous amount of empathy for the moderators of a thoughtful faith. With the things that the church is doing, I have no idea how they are able to moderate that, because to me, the things that the church is doing is just makes it so hard. And a thoughtful faith is, for almost everyone that goes into a thoughtful faith, it's a temporary stay. Very, very few people can reconstruct into a Dan Witherspoon faith in a matter of a few months or a few years. Like, that takes decades to do. And so in any event, they're not perfect, but I know that they've done things that have been unkind. And so I want to hold grace for them because they were a safe place for me. I feel really bad, about people that have been wounded there. And I might have even written things there that wounded people, but in any event, so I'm not there anymore. It's kind of interesting that they call it Waters of Mormon now. And I think some people might not recognize how significant that is, because it's very subversive. And I don't know if it was meant to be that, but the Waters of Mormon are where the faithful people went when to get away from the corruption of Noah and the priests. Like, that's pretty subversive to call it Waters of Mormon. I don't know if they realize that, but, anyway. So the thoughtful faith was a significant part of my journey. So anyway, that takes you my background and my history and my experience into the point where I'm totally public, and I return in 2017 to moderate sessions at Sunstone, and I start accumulating members in my Mormonspectrum group, and then we can break for lunch, and then I'll tell you the next thing.
And there's a listener who asked, first of all, thank you. What a beautiful story so far. Don't go away. We've got more to come. But what a beautiful story. Very graceful, very thoughtful. Everything we hoped for and wanted.
Thank you.
Not to derail, but somebody asked, why are they so harsh? I think meaning the Thoughtful Faith group. Just a tiny bit of history just for fun.
Yep.
I started the Thoughtful Faith podcast, and I started the Thoughtful Faith Facebook group. And honestly, I grabbed the Thoughtful Faith domain before I ever grabbed the Mormon Stories domain, because I'd read a book called A Thoughtful Faith, edited by, I think, Phil Barlow.
Yep.
Back in the 80s when I was at BYU. And I was really just this idea of like Richard Bushman and Laurel Thatcher Ulrich and all these Mormon intellectuals who knew all the history but were faithful. That amazed me in the 80s, and it continued amazing me into the 90s and beyond. And so for many, many years, I wanted to make Mormonism a place that could support people like that. And then after I left the church for a while and felt dark and sad and didn't feel like I had the support I needed to raise my family and have a healthy marriage, I came back and said, well, we need to more explicitly create resources and communities of support for people who are trying to reconcile thought and faith. And so that's when I created the Stay LDS website. That's when I recruited Dan Witherspoon to do Mormon Matters podcast. And then eventually in 2012, I created the A Thoughtful Faith podcast. And I think it was a little before then that I started the A Thoughtful Faith group. But these groups are incredibly hard to moderate. And, with the Mormon Stories group, even before that, I would try and moderate. I wouldn't have been able to do Mormon Stories podcast because moderating Mormon Stories podcast community would be more than a full-time job.
Right.
And I would always try to manage the tone in the Mormon Stories podcast group. And it'd always be super controversial because you could never please the faithful people. But if you were too strict, then the people struggling wouldn't feel validated. And if you tried to create space for the doubters and the people who were angry, you were alienating the faithful people. And it was just impossible. And the same thing happened with the Thoughtful Faith group. But Geraldine Renshaw was like the savior, Yep. And Mark Kriego joined her, if not immediately soon thereafter.
John Grimes and Dan's there,
I'm skipping this little part of history where Micah Nicolaisen and Sarah, spacing on her name, they did the Thoughtful Faith podcast for a little while.
Yep.
Prior to Gina.
Right.
But A Thoughtful Faith was always my almost love song to Mormonism, in a sense of like, even if they kicked me out, even if I couldn't make it work, I am going to still support spaces for people who need it, because I've always believed that is important, and not just a soft landing to then leave. Like I've always been aware that there are some people that are going to be able to make that work. And me and the Open Stories Foundation, I've just always wanted to make sure that was possible. But I just want to say on the record, there's no way the Thoughtful Faith group would have grown and survived without Gerald Lee and Mark Kriego and Dan and, John and all these other people. But really it's Gerald Lee and for a long time, until just very recently, it was Mark. And they have been heroes. Real heroes.
That's my experience. I mean,
real heroes.
They caught me. They were the space that caught me when I needed to be caught in the dark night of the soul.
Yeah. And they've done that for tens of thousands of people.
Unbelievable. But at the same time, when Nelson gives his talk about the empty chairs in heaven, the sad heaven talk, or when they unwind the policy with no apology, no acknowledgement, of the people that committed suicide over this and the pain and everything, whenever Elder Oaks talks, basically, when those things
or Packer before him,
right? Or when the temple language was reordered a little bit, reconfigured. Not necessarily that it says anything different; it's just reworded to be less sexist. That's the group where people can process these things.
Yeah, super important.
But at the same time, then it's too hard for it to feel safe for people that are in the tender early stages, because some people are going to be at a point that they're just not going to be able to put a thoughtful spin on on an Elder Oaks talk, right? So I don't even know how they moderate that.
Yeah, and they don't get paid. You know, it's like if we were to pay Jerry Lee or Mark $15 an hour for their efforts over the past however many years, it would be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars,
nearly 24/7.
And how thankful! Like it's like a Coke machine or a referee. Like if everything goes perfectly, they're never noticed.
Yeah.
And the only time they're noticed is when there's something wrong.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a thankless job. There's no compensation, and they have done it out of the pureness of their hearts for years to the benefit of tens of thousands of people. And so, but the group gets ruined. And so to answer the question, why are they so harsh? It's more like the group gets ruined if they don't moderate. But if you moderate, you piss people off. And there's no graceful way to kick someone off because it means so much to people that they don't want to ever leave. Yeah, I didn't want to leave. So, so people's it meant so much to them. Their hearts are tied to it. Again, all their comments. And so, you know, why did they have to just unceremoniously remove whatever 1,000 people or 900 people or whatever? It doesn't matter. It's because there's no time to negotiate and arbitrate 900 people that need to leave. Right. There's no time to do that, and it would take forever. Yeah. And and otherwise the group dies because the moderators want to all quit and all the people complain all the time. So there's just no way. So this is my love to Jerry Lee and Mark and everyone who's supported that group and everyone who still does. I am sorry. I grieve with the people who have been removed. I'm not trying to invalidate your pain. I'm not trying to make excuses for the behavior. But I have 1,000% compassion and empathy for the role of the mods there. I have gratitude for what they've done. And I hope the Waters of Mormon in its new iteration just has continued health and success because Mormonism needs that space. And the institutional church in 2019 is still not close to providing it. And where else can you go, you know, right now?
Yeah, I love those.
Really, where else can you go?
People, there's nowhere else to go.
I mean, even the Maxwell Institute's trying to start following that. No. But they're not there.
It's not safe for people in the early stages. Yeah. Because, you know, I told this to my local leaders. I said, you know, they were concerned about my Mormonspectrum group, and then we'll get that into the next session. But I said, you know, yours is a pastoral calling. And so your responsibility is to lead people to faithful reconciliations. And for people that are who are deconstructing, that's not safe. They need to be fully validated regardless of where their reconciliations lead them. And you can't do that. That is not your calling. And so we need to have safe spaces where people can deconstruct and vent and be validated whether or not they end up with a faithful reconciliation. You know, they need that. And a thoughtful faith has a window of that, but it can't be all of it because otherwise it wouldn't be a safe place for people in the initial stages. I love those people. Yeah. And I have sat with people who were ugly crying over the trauma of being kicked out too. Right. And it just tears my heart apart. And I just want to hold them in that and sit with them in that. And I don't think that the moderators intend to cause trauma, but they do.
Of course not. Yeah.
And so, you know, that's a very tender thing.
It is. Wendy writes, I can honor the delicacy of the moderator's position, but dropping volumes of people without giving them an explanation is devastating to those who have already been exiled from their tribe. Even a blanket letter, the graceful way is to communicate why they're being removed. And so
I think they would do it differently again now.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But then again, like I'm just 900 form letters, copy, paste. Yeah. And then all the responses of like, hey, like my honest response is yes, Wendy, yes, everyone who's been hurt. And until you realize the excruciating sacrifice of time, you know, go create a group and have 1,000 people in it. And until you've done that, and you've done it for not just a month or 6 months or a year, do it for 5. And then if you've survived, you get to make suggestions to these people. But that probably sounds invalidating because I also am validating the pain.
Every single one of those people are human beings.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, And some of them ugly cried themselves,
Yeah.
you know, to sleep over that. And I just would say, I sit with you in that, you know. Wendy, is it a Wendy that I know?
Yep, Wendy. Wilcox Jensen.
Yes, I sit with you in that.
Yeah.
You know, and if I hadn't been asked to leave in November, I would have been one of those people.
Yeah.
And
I was one of those people.
And you were one of those people.
But I, you know, but I get it.
It's just.
But I get it.
Yeah.
And we love everyone, and we understand everyone.
I sit with you in that.
Our hearts are with everyone.
Absolutely.
Everyone affected. It's just one of those hard things about Mormon internet.
So just like saying to validate someone's experience doesn't mean agreeing with it.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. To
validate the messiness of what happens doesn't mean that I agree with or justify what happened.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
And boy, I wish that it was done differently, and I'm sure that they wish that it was done differently.